So, welcome to this next installment of the Northwest China Council's China Chat series. I'm Joe Liston, the president of the Northwest China Council for this 40th anniversary year. Helping coordinate and produce this event tonight is John Wong, executive director of the Northwest China Council. Thanks, John, for all your help with this. Some of you may not be that familiar with the Northwest China Council. We are a US-based educational nonprofit formed in 1980, just after the normalization of relations with China. We were formed from a grant from the Asia Society to improve understanding of Chinese culture and to promote greater cultural understanding between the United States and China. At one point, there were several China councils around the US, but I believe we are the final one left. Normally, we hold events like language lessons, cultural events, lectures, sometimes in partnership with local universities. But with this global pandemic you may be aware of, it's made things a bit more difficult. And so we've had to pivot and rely a bit more on virtual events like this one. And speaking of virtual events, let me introduce our exciting guest for the evening. Dexter Tiff Roberts is an author, speaker, and analyst on China economics, business, and politics. He presently serves as a non-resident senior fellow in the Atlantic Council's Asia Security Initiative and a fellow at the Mansfield Center at the University of Montana. Previously, he was a reporter and China bureau chief for Bloomberg Businessweek and was based in Beijing for more than 2 decades. He has interviewed numerous Chinese and foreign CEOs as well as senior government officials and has reported from all of China's provinces and regions, including Tibet and Xinjiang, as well as Hong Kong, Taiwan, Mongolia, and North Korea. His latest book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, was published in March 2020, and you can find it on Amazon.com and I believe Portland's local powellsbooks.com. You may be able to find it there as well. So with that, once again, if you have questions, feel free to submit them to the using the Q&A function. But with that, I'm going to hand it off to you, Tiff. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Joe, and thank you also, John, for arranging this and hosting this. I should start by saying that I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to talk to the Northwest China Council. And I have a bit of a connection to Portland, Oregon. My mother actually is from Portland, and I today still have many relatives and many friends in the Portland area. And I hope some of them are tuned in this evening. I know a few are. So anyway, this is particularly meaningful for me to have this opportunity to present my book and some of my thoughts on China today to the Northwest China Council. I'm going to start by trying to pull up some slides here. Okay, I think I'm successfully doing this. So,
yeah, it looks good.
Great. So I'd like to talk today about some of the policies that still exist today. I call them legacy policies because they date back many, many years, well before China's reform and opening in the early 80s to the Mao era, and how they hold back the lives of a significant portion of the Chinese population, and why they're therefore a real obstacle to China's continued economic transition, which, by the way, has huge implications for the rest of the world and for countries and companies that have become so reliant on Chinese growth. I'm going to address these topics by doing a brief introduction to my book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism. And I'd like to say right at the beginning that if you find today interesting and the topics that we discuss something you want to pursue more, please do go out and get my book and read it, because it will, by the nature of being in book form, is a much more in-depth treatment of some of these things that we will talk about today. So to start out, I'd like to talk about the origins of my book. And to do so, you have to go all the way back to the year 2000. I had been in China as a reporter for Businessweek for about 5 years at that point. And in the year 2000 was a notable year for me. It was the first time that, not the first time I visited Guangdong province, which has been the center of the export-led economy in China. I'd been there before, But that year I went back to Guangdong, and I also visited, and this was the first time, one of the interior provinces, Guizhou in southwestern China, which then and still today is one of the poorest provinces in all of China. And so there were two cover stories that I was working on for Businessweek. I'm going to show you some images here. The first one was called, as you can see the cover here, came out in May of 2000. It was on China's wealth gap. At that point, China's then leader, Jiang Zemin, President Jiang Zemin, had launched a policy called Develop the West. And the goal of that policy was to try to deal with this persistent, problematic, and growing wealth gap, mainly between rural China and urban China, and between the coast and the interior. And this gap was growing quite rapidly, even as China became wealthier and wealthier following Deng Xiaoping and earlier leaders, a very important leader, obviously, paramount leader Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening. So this wealth gap was getting larger, and this major national policy was launched to try to address that wealth gap, to try to encourage investment into the interior of China, and start to deal with the policy of Deng Xiaoping, which had been, in effect, let some people get rich first, and now sort of a Chinese Deng Xiaoping version of trickle down, or Jiang Zemin version with Develop the West. They wanted to see that wealth spread more evenly. So I did this story. The second story took me back to both Guangdong and Guizhou, the province, the very poor province. Later in the year was this one here, the Great Migration. And this policy was about those rural youth that were just then starting to leave the countryside in great numbers and travel to the cities to work in the factories and the construction sites. And that large flow was just starting to take off. And so I did these two covers that year. Both of them had a very large impact on me. And there was a growing realization that I had then that these issues, both the wealth gap and this great migration of people, were really a crucial part of China's modern economic story. And I would argue, and I will today, and I argue in my book, that they really defined this made China factory to the world model, which went on to become so important to China. So just about a little over a year after I visited both these places was another very important story, particularly as a business journalist. I was completely focused on it for about a year, but also really, really important to the modern development of China. And that was, okay, one more slide here. So again, just this slide here I've got on the left, it's actually an auto factory in Guangzhou. It's up the river from the city of Dongguan, which is really the factory heart of China's export miracle, and the city that I feature in my book. And on the right, this is actually the village that I visited several times that year in Guizhou, a small village called Binghuacun. Both these pictures are more recent. I got a little bit ahead of myself here. Anyway, during those visits, first in Dongguan, Guangdong, and then later in Guizhou province, I met the Mo's. And this is in some ways, a fairly typical group of migrants, all from the same village. As is true in many villages, small villages in China, they all shared the same surname and they were all distantly related. And they had left this village in southeastern Guizhou of Binghuacun, and most of them that had left had ended up in Dongguan. This is Mo Rubo. He was then about 20 years old. As you can see, he was a welder in a components factory, a Taiwanese-owned components factory. And at this point, he'd already been traveling China for more than 5 years. He'd worked in the Shanghai area, he'd worked in Ningbo, he'd worked in various parts of Guangdong. He was one of the earlier youth to actually leave this village. And here he is in Dongguan as a welder. Again, Mo Rubois, and I should say he's someone that I really feature in my book and I stayed in touch with over all the years, and I'm still in touch with today. Here he is with his then girlfriend, who was from a different part of China. She was from Henan, much closer to Beijing, also very agricultural, also a source of migrants, a major source of migrants like Guizhou to the coastal factories. And here they are in a street in Dongguan. And then, as I said, that same year, 2000, I went back to Binghuacun and met some of those same Mo youth that I had met in the factories in Dongguan back in their village. And the young woman in the red vest here, his name is Mo Meichuan. She had gone back to her village for two reasons. One, to help her parents with the rice harvest. It was still very much a subsistence rice economy there. Along with fruit and vegetables they grew in the mountains. But also she went back to try to update her identity card, because at that point, as a migrant worker, you were very, very vulnerable in the cities to local police. And if you had an outdated or expired identity card, which she had, you could get picked up by the police and in effect be forced to pay a bribe to be released from these holding cells. So she was back updating her ID card and helping her parents. One more picture from Binghuacun, again from 2000. This is the village, then very poor, still quite poor today, sadly. And I should note here as I continue, before I continue, that these photos were all taken by a really great photographer, Greg Girard, who's an old friend of mine. He was along on these trips on these reporting trips to Guangdong and Guizhou, and on many other reporting trips I did. And he very kindly allowed me to use his photos in black and white form in my book. So that's an added bonus in the book. So as I started to say earlier, a year later, you fast forward a year plus, China enters the World Trade Organization in late 2001. As I was saying, as a business journalist, this is what I was very focused on for quite a while, covering first the bilateral accession agreement that was negotiated between the US and China in 1999, and then China's eventual entry to the World Trade Organization in 2001. As probably many of you know, tariffs were slashed on multiple products on both sides, the US side, EU, the European or Europe then, and in China. Some of those tariffs are back in place now with the trade war. But really, it was a further step in opening up China's economy, brought in an enormous flood of foreign investment, in part led to a much more rapid reform of the state enterprises in China, the creation of a housing market, and the sort of the rise of a middle class in China. So very, very important. And arguably, one of the key moments in modern reform era for China. So here's a much more recent picture. This is also Guizhou. The push to develop infrastructure throughout China, which was really launched back in 2000 with this earlier policy of develop the West, continued and also helped to transform rural China. This is an expressway not too far from the village of Binghuacun. Obviously, as has been much written about, China created the world's most impressive high-speed rail system. And all this did help to continue to grow the economy and also to continue to lift living standards. Stepping back in time a little bit, back in 2000 when I was working on these two cover stories, I did have this realization, as I said, that both the wealth gap and also this migration of people was very, very important for the future of China. And I had a very wise editor at the time who actually said to me when I did those cover stories, you might want to do a book on these topics sometime in the future. And that 20 years later, I finally published my book earlier this year. So anyway, I did get that idea to focus, and my reporting first with Businessweek and later with Bloomberg, after Bloomberg bought Businessweek, very much focused on manufacturing, on migrants, and on China's continuing effort to try to deal with this wealth gap, which I should say continued to grow. So fast forward till more recent years, and what we've seen is, as I said, this tremendous growth in the Chinese economy. I think when I arrived in China to stay and work, which was in early '95, China was somewhere near the bottom of the top 10 or so GDPs in the world. Now today it's number 2 GDP, purchasing power parity, it's already the largest. And most people expect it to surpass the United States and become the world's largest GDP at some point in the not too distant future. We have China, they set some important centennial goals to try to continue to improve the livelihood of the people. One was eliminating absolute poverty. And that's supposed to happen at the end of this year by 2021. That happens to be the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China, which was in 1921. So they set this 100-year goal to eliminate absolute poverty. And around the same time, they've also said that they are going to see that GDP per capita, average GDP per capita reaches about 10,000 US dollars. And it looks like both those goals they're about to achieve. They may have to be slightly delayed because of COVID-19, but the reality is they are going to come close to achieving those goals. So the progress is extremely substantial, very impressive. What the party, which is the Chinese Communist Party, which is the government, has achieved over all these years, and that's undeniable. But as I talk about in my book, we have some still very serious disparities within the Chinese economy between rural and urban China and between the coastal area in the West, which I argue in the book are a real obstacle to actually China continuing its economic growth that we've seen for the last few decades. And just to cite a few numbers here, when I arrived in China in the mid-90s, the overall gap between average urban incomes and average rural incomes was about 1 to 3. So people in the cities on average were making about 3 times what they make in the countryside. China's been trying to narrow that gap ever since then. The gap is still about 1 to 3. So that's been very, very difficult, and they haven't made much progress. At the same time, we've seen overall living standards go up dramatically. We've also seen a somewhat alarming, to me, quite alarming growth in a wealth gap. And 2 parts to that. One, the wealth gap is already very large. It is on par with what some people would call kleptocratic Russia. Not everyone realizes that China has a wealth gap, which is about comparable to Russia, probably worse than the United States. And that is growing extremely quickly. It's growing about as fast as it has been growing in Russia as well. So those gaps continue to face a tremendous challenge to China's continued economic growth. And I argue, and today I'd like to make this point, and again, I argue in my book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, that those gaps have so much to do with a couple of legacy policies that still are very much alive and well in China today. So the first policy, and the one that I really focus on in my book, is the household registration policy. And so what is the household registration policy? I mean, first of all, a little bit about its history. Depending on what China scholar you speak to, China has had some sort of household registration system going back centuries. But what we see today in China really has its origins in the 1950s. And at that time, Mao Zedong, taking his cue from Stalin in the former Soviet Union, which he too often did, decided that having an internal passport system, the Soviet Union had something called the Propiska, which was their version, Stalin's version of an internal passport system. Mao decided that it was important in China to ensure that there would not be large flows of people around the country, and in particular, that he would have a somewhat captive population in rural China, then in the communes, that would be able to produce low-cost food and grain for the cities as Mao tried to pursue this goal of rapid industrialization. And so he put in place this policy. So today, the household registration, we saw huge shifts. One thing that most notable, it no longer controls where people go to work. As I mentioned earlier, we have a massive migration of people around China, some 300 million strong probably today. So people don't have to, they aren't really attached to the land physically to the degree that they were in the early days under the household registration system. But what has not changed about the household registration system is the fact that the social welfare benefits that China provides to its people, particularly in particular healthcare, pensions, and education for the children, is tied to one's household registration. And what it means today for your migrant worker is that in most cases, the migrant families are not able to get the same level of healthcare in the same clinics and hospitals in the cities as those that have an urban household registration can get. And they are not able to put their children into the same the same public or affordable urban schools, which tend to be much better, and as a result often end up leaving their families behind when these migrants come to work on the coast. So it also has given rise to a very sad phenomena today in China, which is the left behind children phenomena, which is the fact that the majority of migrant worker children end up spending a good portion of their youth growing up separated from their parents, left behind, if you will, in the villages. And it's also created this phenomena of what China calls the empty nest villages, which are villages that are now hollowed out, which are mainly populated today just by the very young and by the grandparents, both of which have stayed behind because of this household registration policy. Another very important policy that is a major constraint on China today is the continuing strength of this dual land policy, which again dates back to the Mao era. What it means in effect is that most people in the countryside, and that includes migrants who typically will hold on to a small plot of land back even as they go to the factories or the construction sites or the service jobs in the cities, most of them are unable to actually really benefit from that land. And that means when they rent it, or if they are able to sell it in some cases, they almost never do so at market rates. This stands in great contrast to what we've seen in the urban parts of China, which is, most of you probably know, we've seen an explosion of wealth, mainly generated by the buying and selling of apartments. And so this dual land policy actually is also a key factor, a key reason for this growing wealth gap we see in China today. Simply the fact that people that have urban hukou and have urban property have in many cases been able to become quite wealthy, whereas the other half of China, which again, it is about one half, 300 million migrant workers, and another similarly large group of their relatives in the countryside, have not been able to benefit. And it's behind this persistent struggle that the Chinese leadership has faced in trying to reverse the wealth gap in China as well. Before I finish up here quickly, this is a picture very recently of Mo Rubo, the same young man, young then that you saw welding in a factory and you saw on the street in an earlier slide with his girlfriend. This is the same woman who's now his wife, and this is about just over 3 years ago when I visited them. He's one of the migrants that has he's left behind factory work. He's become a small entrepreneur, very much struggling, sadly. It's a very difficult business. He has a sportswear business where he sources sportswear and sells it online. During this visit, he still lives not far from the factory I first met him at in the year 2000 in a part of Dongguan city called Chang'an. And this was his home office. And when I visited him, he and his wife were struggling with the decision of where their daughter would get her education. I believe she was 5 then, about to enter primary school. And they basically had 2 choices. One was send her back to their village, to Binghuacuan or the local township nearby, and basically resolve themselves to her growing up away from them for most of the year. Typically, migrant workers would only go back during the Chinese New Year and see their children and their relatives then, usually once a year. Or alternately, put her into one of these small private schools that have sprung up that in most cities where migrants live in China that cater to the children of migrant workers. These private schools are usually of much lower quality. They are also often quite expensive. So he was struggling with that. He told me, I don't want my daughter to be a left behind child. We're gonna find a school here in Dongguan and put her in no matter how much it costs. And so that was what he was trying to figure out during this visit. As I think maybe Joe mentioned earlier, my book came out in March of this year, March 10th to be precise. I was in New York for the launch, and that was just, if you recall, when New York City at least was waking up to the fact that they had a serious problem with COVID-19. I had to cut short some activities and leave New York earlier than I had planned. But in any case, if you do read my book later, you will see that nowhere in my book is COVID-19 mentioned. As I said, it came out right as sort of the United States at least woke up to the reality of COVID-19. Even though it's not mentioned in the book, I would argue today that my book even has perhaps a larger relevance because of what we're now facing and what China in particular is facing with COVID-19. A point I make in my book is that China is facing one of the biggest economic transitions in decades, arguably as big as the transition back when Deng Xiaoping, the previous leader, launched reform and opening in the late 70s and the early 80s. So what is the transition today? It is the transition from this old factory to the world model, which was very much based on the low wages of migrant workers and was very effective in growing Chinese economy, but is much less so effective now, particularly as wages have gone up. China has a growing labor population, and even now, although it's still very large working age population, it has a shrinking overall working age population, in part because of the one-child policy. So China now really has to move away from this factory to the world model, and they're very clear what they want to do. They want to move to a much more service-driven economy, and also an economy that is much more reliant on the spending power of its own people. And COVID-19, as I said, really brought the necessity and the urgency of moving more quickly towards accomplishing that transition to the Chinese leadership. They've been talking about this transition for over 5 years, but it became very, very clear during COVID-19 and arguably during the 2-year trade war as well that China could not rely to the degree that it has in the past on the external world and needs to rely much more on the spending power of its own people. Xi Jinping, by the way, has publicly said that we need to create a much more domestic consumption-driven economy. So why does that make the situation China faces today and that I outline in my book with these legacy policies more imperative? That is because not only are both these 2 policies I just described earlier really sort of human rights issues, where you have about half the population being systematically discriminated against today in China, but they also make this transition very, very difficult. And that is because of the hukou, because of the dual land policy, hukou being the household registration policy, China struggles to actually lift spending power of its own population. It's still about 40% of GDP, so domestic consumption as a proportion of GDP in China today is about 40%. That's something that it's been stuck around 40% for a very long time, And it just doesn't seem to be getting any higher. That compares to a global average of something closer to 60%. And so why is that? It really is because a significant portion of the Chinese population today is stuck in this second-class status. They end up not spending very much. The flip side of having low consumption is they save a lot. China has one of the highest saving rates in the world. And COVID-19 seems to have accelerated. The savings rate has actually gone up during COVID-19 as people have started to worry more and more about the future in China. Very quickly, before we move to questions, which is be far more interesting, I'm sure, China really has two ways it can go now. One path, which I very much hope is the one they take, and they've been talking about for a long time, is to move much more quickly to reform the household registration of the hukou policy and the dual land policy, which I argue would unleash tremendous new spending power, tremendous new productivity in the economy, and would help them make this transition to a new kind of economy. And COVID-19, as I said, may make them realize that they need to move more quickly with these reforms. The other side, which unfortunately we're seeing signs of already, is sort of a doubling down on these policies, growing worries about having free migration in the country, growing prejudice against the migrant workers who the early signs of COVID-19 show are less welcome in the cities and in their jobs than they were before. So we really, this is a sort of a start moment for China where these reform policies could be abandoned finally, or things could actually, they could tighten them. And this would be very bad for its economic transition. I'm going to stop here and hand it over to Joe, and let's get to the question part.
Yes, and we have a lot of questions, a lot of good questions. So let's get started. And you can submit them through chat as well. Some of you have done that. Let's see, let me scroll up. Okay, Mike has several good questions. I'll read the first two for you to answer. In reading the Wall Street Journal yesterday, China's growth is 3% so far this year. How accurate do you think that is? Second question is, real estate is undergoing a bubble in China. When that pops, what are the economic indicators for China?
So on the second quarter numbers, I mean, you step back to the first quarter, I think China announced that there'd been a drop of 6.8% in growth. It was unprecedented for them for that to happen and for them to announce it publicly. The economists that follow the economy in China and follow the statistics much more even closely than I do, sort of heralded that first quarter. And they said everyone knew the economy contracted, and it was kudos to the Chinese government for actually admitting to it. 3.2% for the second quarter is actually, I've been talking to a lot of economists about that number right now. And most of them are skeptical. They are concerned because apparently the word on the street in China now is, in order to meet these millennial goals, eliminating absolute poverty and seeing average per capita GDP of 10,000 by the end of this year, they may need to actually record something like around 3% growth. And I mean, the point that the economists make is, if you look at the economy right now, undeniably there's been, China has recovered. So what, it may not be 3.2%, I personally don't think it is, but it's doing much, much better than it was in the first quarter. But there are some really worrying signs. I would characterize the recovery we've seen so far as this new sort of dual track economy. We've seen growth that's mainly been powered by investment that has benefited some of the old state enterprises and has come at the, have not seen that that similar progress shared by your average consumer, nor by private enterprises for that matter. So if you look at household consumption, if you look at income growth, those numbers are not looking good at all. So China, it appears to be juicing the economy, which it can do through control of the banks and the state enterprises. The factories are working overtime again. What people are fearful of, or economists are fearful or worried about, is that during the second half, we see continued problems with income growth, growing unemployment potentially, and a growing overcapacity problem, which will then, right now we have an income growth and a household consumption problem. We'll add an overcapacity problem later in the year. So, so I think that's a real concern. The housing market is going full guns. Again, part of this dual track economy. If you look at different parts of the different consumer sectors, you can see that lower middle income class people are not doing well. If you look at cars, for example, compact car sales are doing very poorly. Luxury cars are doing very good. If you look at smartphone sales have been good. Same thing with the real estate market. You see a lot of activity there. Back to the migrant workers. I mean, if you a number from the second quarter, they saw their incomes drop by 7%, and they are a significant portion of the overall workforce. So that's very alarming. I think ultimately the housing bubble, which is very much still alive, is a real problem. Most of the people, we've seen this explosion of household wealth, as I said earlier, in urban China. Most of the people that have benefited from it have never seen a real downturn in China. They've never seen their household wealth fall as precipitously as it would if the housing market bubble is punctured. And we continue to see very, very high vacancy rates. I was talking to an economist who came up, he's come up with some very interesting ways to look at vacancy rates, sort of shocked China a few years ago, a professor named Gan Li out in Chengdu. And I was talking to him yesterday, actually. He says the vacancy rates are getting much worse.
Interesting. A few more questions from Mike, but I'm going to jump to a question from Michael Bloom. Among my Chinese manufacturing associates, Dongguan does have a lot of factories, but has an especially poor reputation for quality. They have also cast aspersions upon the business ethics in Dongguan. I've heard this from several close associates. Have you run across this impression?
So Dongguan, yeah, I mean, I first started going to factories in Dongguan a long time ago, actually in the late 90s. And I mean, arguably, there was, the sweatshops were, sweatshops galore back then, a real reputation for poor quality. Arguably, they've made real progress, I think, in the intervening years. Certainly the worst of the labor abuses that were so obvious back then have largely vanished from factories in Dongguan. And I do think I think there has been an improvement in quality overall. The one phenomena that's interesting that I've seen in recent years is what I would call sort of the Taobao factory phenomena. And as China admirably so has tried to improve quality and improve labor standards in the factories, we've seen a counter effort by some of the smaller factories to try to evade quality standards or labor standards in the factories. And this Taobao, referring to Alibaba's Taobao market, where we've seen this phenomena of Taobao villages, has seen sort of a resurgence of smaller factories that don't necessarily have a very long longevity. In some cases, they're started by migrant workers that have returned to the villages. And those factories tend to have much lower standards. And so we're seeing that even as China did make all this progress over these years, I think we're seeing again sort of a resurgence of some of the old bad habits, which interestingly, e-commerce has sort of accelerated.
Okay, a couple more from Mike. So a couple questions. What are the long-term implications of the one-child policy and its aging population? That's his first question. And then the second one is, I read that the economic miracle wasn't financed by Deng Xiaoping's initiatives, rather pooled money in villages in southeastern China. How much of that is correct?
So, okay. So the two questions. So I'm sorry. The first question, remind me. So yeah. I just got distracted by that very good question about South.
Yeah, I'll read the first one again.
Yeah.
The first one is, what are the long-term implications of the one-child policy and China's aging population?
Yeah. So I mean, I think I mean, first of all, the damage has been done, if you will. China several years ago started to do away with the one-child policy in hopes of trying to boost the birth rate and start to, redress some of these challenges that are growing very rapidly because of the one-child policy. And what they saw was like a one-year baby boom that immediately faded out. And the reality is most people in China now have reached an income level, and in some cases an education level, where they don't want to have large families anymore. And that is a big problem for China. To state some of the obvious things, we have a situation where local governments are facing increasing pension costs for larger and larger number of older and retired workers. The healthcare costs of an aging population, again, are often falling on local governments, which in China are responsible for, the Chinese fiscal system requires that the local governments rather than the central government take care of most of the social welfare, including pensions and healthcare. And we see a similar burden on families where, a smaller and smaller working age population is supporting a larger retiree population. Finally, I think it's a real challenge for China's goals to create a more innovative economy, which they've been talking about for years. And there's very interesting research that shows that a rapidly aging population doesn't tend to be very innovative at all. And we saw that in Japan, and there's an interesting book, some books written on this. So China says that it wants to make a much more innovative economy, even as its population ages rapidly. That's not going to be easy at all. I think those obstacles are not going to go away. They are behind the effort to really aggressively push more automation in Chinese factories, which I think is something that needs to be done if China wants to continue to maintain its manufacturing prowess, which they do. But again, it's going to be a problem going forward for a long, long time. On the second question, you had this whole phenomena of what so-called township and village enterprises, and Getihu, which are like very small companies, basically family-run factories that all rose up. The township and village enterprises were often factories that had been owned by a township, so they were officially publicly owned, and then they took off their red hat, as they said, and which meant setting aside their party affiliation and were in effect privatized. And some of the most vibrant companies that have come out of China have their origins there. Whether you look at automaker Geely from Zhejiang, Wahaha, which is a very big consumer goods company, and others. A lot of them, even Alibaba also comes out of Zhejiang. A lot of them came out of there. So they did play a real crucial role in China's growth. I guess I would just say one of the challenges going forward is the fact that over the last 5-6 years, we've seen a real renewed emphasis on the big state enterprise in China. And this very much comes from the top. President and Party Secretary Xi Jinping has made it very clear that state enterprises should once again play a very large role in the Chinese economy. And that often basically means that those private enterprises that have done so much and been so important to the Chinese economic miracle don't get access to the credit from the banks that they might have gotten, and are often systematically discriminated against. And we see that I see that as a growing trend in China today.
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to jump to a question from Colin. So, which, if any, leaders in China are addressing these legacy issues, which I'm guessing he means the hukou and the land issues?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Thank you, Colin. So actually, China's premier, Li Keqiang, who's been unfortunately overshadowed, including even in economic policy making, which traditionally would be the purview of the premier rather than the president and party secretary, is someone who's actually really focused on these issues. He did his dissertation, actually, which was a real dissertation, unlike some other Chinese leaders that did dissertations right out of the Cultural Revolution and often didn't really do the coursework. Li Keqiang did the coursework, apparently, and his dissertation was focused on urbanization in China and looked at the issue of household registration and how the continuing strength of that policy is an obstacle to this rebalancing of the economy. And so he's put a lot of effort into that. Liu He, who's sort of the right hand, he's been the right hand man of Xi Jinping on the trade war, is also someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about this. He has written papers on doing studies looking at the hollowing out of industry in Japan, and basically looked at different ways to try to avoid that same hollowing out happening to manufacturing in China. There are there's no lack of very, very intelligent leaders in China that have dealt with these questions. The reform of both those policies has been talked about for many years. The most recent, not that recent, 7 years ago. 7 years ago was a very important moment. There was a party plenum of the Communist Party in November 2013. It was a third plenum, which is typically when China makes big economic pronouncements. The third plenum was when Deng Xiaoping launched Reform and Opening back in 78, 79. This third plenum announced to much fanfare that they were going to move quickly to reform the household registration policy and the dual land policy, and laid out a bit of a blueprint, and also dealt with very much, was front and center. They dealt with the fact that if they did not do this, they would not be able to make this coming economic transition. So if you look, fast forward 7 years, arguably, I make this argument, there's been very little progress. Most of the household registration reforms that we have seen have been piecemeal. They've been pilot projects in different cities, and they've all been top down. So the central government will designate certain cities as those being welcome, those open to hukou reform that will then allow migrant workers with rural hukou to go through a process, in theory, to be able to get local hukou. But what is not usually dealt with in these calculations is where the migrants actually want to go. In many cases, cities that aren't actually doing very well have been those that have been most eager to welcome in the migrants, thinking that somehow they will help jumpstart local economies. In some cases, these are even cities that have had problems with ghost towns, overbuilt residential areas, and there's this idea that the migrants will come in and buy up the apartments. But they don't get to the question of how, this sort of magical idea that somehow the migrants are going to jumpstart local economies if the economies are already suffering. Those cities that have been most appealing to migrants, the big showcase cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, also many of the provincial capitals, have been those that have been least welcoming, and in many cases in recent years have actually shut the door, in effect, more on migrants. Beijing and Shanghai have targets to reduce their populations, which specifically are being achieved by driving out the migrant populations.
Excuse me. Next, we'll move to a couple of questions from Michael Bloom. First one, is there any likelihood that the central government will allow private land ownership for either residential real estate or commercial real estate?
So they're getting on, in effect, now the urban housing, residential has been 70-year long-term leases, and I think most commercial is 30 or 35 years. And in some cases, they're getting to the duration of those. And typically what they've done is they sort of re-upped the 70-year or the 30-year. Some people had been hoping that they might deed property in perpetuity, like we have here in the U.S. and many places in the world. I'm not optimistic that's going to happen. We've seen statements by President and Party Secretary Xi Jinping, which have emphasized, this is in rural land, he's emphasized the importance of collective ownership of land. Technically, land in the countryside has been owned by the collective, which is effectively the local governments, ever since the Mao era. And he, particularly in rural areas, has said that the collective they won't step away from that ownership. And that's been the significant obstacle to reforming the land. Again, just on the rural side, they face a real obstacle in reforming rural land, because even as the inhabitants or the migrants have not been able to benefit or monetize rural land in the countryside, that doesn't mean everybody hasn't been able to benefit. And the people that have been able to benefit is basically local officials. They are able to, in effect, to redistrict land from agricultural use to commercial use or residential use, build apartment blocks, and or set up factory zones, and typically make a lot of money. They would give the rural people a nominal sum, and then they would go through this redistricting process and make a lot of money. And local governments are pretty much hooked on local land revenues. Some estimates say up to 40% of local government revenues are coming from land proceeds. So even as China talks about the need to do away with the dual land system, they have a big problem in figuring out how they're going to finance local governments, even if indeed they do take some of that monetizing land ability away from the local governments. So I think in both urban and rural China, I don't see a lot of signs now that they are going to move towards real private ownership.
And his next question, in Guangdong, especially Shenzhen, private entrepreneurs are receiving foreign payments through the Hong Kong banking system. With the recent changes in Hong Kong, will this path be blocked?
I think, all bets are off for anyone doing business that goes through Hong Kong. Hong Kong, as we know it, is rapidly being dismantled. The latest news, arrests of 4 young people, teenagers, for simply advocating against the national security law on social media. A bunch of local representatives, including ones that are serving right now, just announced that they will not be able to stand for election in the future because they simply question the national security law. And then the U.S. response, which seems to have some teeth in it, in terms of taking away the special benefits on tariffs and imposing visa restrictions on officials from Hong Kong. And now there's, certainly issues with finance. So, I don't know the degree to which I think that those local entrepreneurs that are reliant on Hong Kong banks for their business, they're not going to be the first ones affected. It's going to be Hong Kong businesses that are trying to do business with the world or with the United States in particular.
And kind of sort of touching on the relationship between the U.S. and China, let me read you Colin's question. Could you comment on the current spate of U.S. flogging of China on a wide range of issues, culminating so far in the consulate closures? It's hard to say for me, for some reason. Do you see things changing following a change in leadership in the U.S. this fall?
So, I mean, to state the obvious, the relationship is spiraling down to lows that we haven't seen in decades. And certainly now I think back to, and I was talking to a friend who runs the European Chamber of Commerce in Beijing and has been there for 4 decades. And everyone's saying we've reached the moment right after Tiananmen Square in 1989 in terms of this rupture that China is experiencing with the US and also with other countries around the world. And, but not long ago, we saw the expulsions of a whole bunch of journalists, American journalists, many of which were my friends. So it hit home for me. And at that point, I was talking to friends and we were saying, the next step ratcheting up the tensions is to actually kick out diplomats. And, here we are with the closure of Houston and Chengdu. I think that the tensions are being inflamed on both sides. There's guilt plenty to go around. I think on the Chinese side, the decision to go forward with the national security law in Hong Kong was a gigantic message to the world that we don't care what you think. Politics in command. We know there'll be economic repercussions. We don't care. We have decided that ensuring security over Hong Kong and demonstrating the strong leadership from Beijing is a lot more important. So they knew sanctions would come from the US and they went ahead with it. They knew more people would take to the streets in Hong Kong and they didn't care. If you look at what happened in India with the violent clash there, if you look at Chinese fighter jets that now are regularly flying across the unofficial midpoint line in the Taiwan Strait, ship clashes with Vietnam, tensions around the Japanese Senkaku Islands, or the Diaoyutai, as the Chinese call it. China is, this wolf warrior diplomacy that a lot of people have written about is alive and well, and it shows no signs of going away. So I think we see a response, not surprisingly, from the world, which is pushing back and asking, what does this mean and where is this going to go? On the other side, with the U.S., the Trump administration, absolutely, we're seeing, I think, election-motivated efforts to fan the flames higher and make the relationship worse. A calculation has been made that says that being really harsh on China is going to win votes. And I think the Democratic opponent through Joe Biden, the putative Democratic runner, Joe Biden, has probably made the same calculation. And I think that's made things worse. There's a Pew Trust survey out yesterday or today that shows that 76% of Americans now distrust the Chinese government. It's a dramatic growth from a few years ago. So yeah, there's perhaps they're right that fanning the flames with China will make things, will potentially win them votes. Post-election, I'm not very optimistic. I think that ultimately the tensions that we're seeing, first of all, I think, as I said, much of it's coming from the Chinese side as well. And I do think that ultimately we're seeing an unsurprising but disturbing and frightening clash between the United States, a country that sort of has ruled the roost globally for a long time and arguably will not do so to the degree that which it did in the past anymore, and has no desire to see this upstart China play as large a role as it would like to play. And on the other side, China, which is, as I said earlier, it's on its way to possibly becoming the largest country in the world by GDP. It has big military ambitions, and it clearly wants to play a much, much larger international role. And I think that clash, or that dilemma between the rising power and the more established power or declining power will not go away, and will continue to bedevil the relationship after the election, even with the change in the U.S. president.
Well, Tiff, it's the top of the hour. Do you have time for a few more questions, or do you have a hard stop? Or
I do. No, I feel like we've barely gotten started. So yeah, a few more questions would be great.
Okay. Well, let's see. It looks like there's a couple more from Mike here. So he writes, what are the implications of shadow banks in China? In your book, you mentioned that authorities announced a 10-year-long national plan for medium long-term education reform and development. How is that coming along? So that was two questions.
The shadow sector has been, it goes through waves of where they try to control it. They get worried about it. Arguably it played also an important role in actually supporting the private sector with the state bank, with the banking banks still largely owned by the state. They've struggled, even as the leadership has repeatedly told banks to loan more to small and medium-sized companies and private enterprises. They've struggled to actually make that happen. And that's been a problem for the growth of private enterprise. Typically what they've done is they've turned to the shadow sector. And some of that, again, has been healthy in sort of encouraging the growth of private companies. The other side of that is it's unregulated and it's in the shadows, and often tied to, in one example, to property investments that could go south if the bubble was popped. So there is a web of shadow banking, which is also a financial risk to the economy. They tend to, as I said, go through stages where the shadow banking sector becomes so large, maybe there's some parts of it show signs of weakness. They're afraid of collapses. In some cases, shadow banking has been fueled by almost Ponzi-like schemes where a lot of individuals have invested into these financial vehicles that supposedly guarantee high rates of return. And so there's a social stability issue if these companies actually go under. But it will continue to play a role for that very reason, that it has been important, I think, in a banking system that is still so state dominated. On the education reform plan, this is a big issue for China. because despite the fact that they've been talking for many years about trying to redress an educational gap, a very real educational gap between rural China and urban China, it still is very much there. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One reason is that local governments are responsible for paying for education, and governments like Shanghai, which have very good education systems, not surprisingly have that, because the government there has quite a bit of money. Whereas if you go to Guizhou with some local government, they may be cash strapped and they can't put as much money into it. So there's been a lot of effort, and there's been these national 10-year plan that you mentioned to sort of try to narrow the gap and improve overall education. There's been an effort to build, and a lot of money gone into build hardware for rural schools. There's been a huge number of new boarding schools that have been put into rural China, which often look very impressive and have good sports fields, but don't typically have very good instruction or very good teachers. And the argument I make in my book is that they can have all the 10-year plans in the world, and they can pump all this money into trying to build beautiful rural schools. But if they actually wanted to really improve or narrow the gap in education, they need to basically stop this system through the household registration that in effect bars rural students from the better schools in China, which are those in the cities.
Here's a question from Michael Bloom. Foreign employers of Chinese nationals are required to contribute to housing, unemployment, medical, and retirement funds. Will the Chinese safety net grow to require these of Chinese employers?
Well, according to the law, Chinese employers are supposed to pay, and they're supposed to pay the same amount. If you do look at the reality on the ground, particularly with the migrant workforce, very often those social welfare benefits are not being paid in full. And I should say, sometimes it's a two-way street where the managers, Chinese managers or overseas Chinese managers of factories will actually say to the migrant workers, look, you don't put in your portion of the social welfare program, I won't put in mine, you'll have more take-home pay. And the migrant workers will often say, good. There's not a good history of these social welfare benefits being portable. So migrant workers are rightfully suspicious that years of contributing from their salaries into the social welfare benefit programs, they might not actually ultimately see that money. It often happens when the nature of their job, they're migrants and they move to a new factory that, for example, the pension benefit often, if they have been paying into it, does not go with them. So we have seen, to answer Mike's question, we have seen a very strong tendency where Chinese companies, the smaller Chinese companies in particular, do not contribute the full social welfare benefits. And when the economy goes south and things get worse, often local governments will actually issue edicts that say, you don't have to contribute the full amount, or you contribute half as much as you did before. And in that case, I would imagine, although I haven't looked at the specifics really closely, I think the local companies probably would be the usual beneficiaries. Typically, they wouldn't go to the foreign companies and try to cut them a deal unless they were afraid the foreign companies were going to pick up and leave and close the factory. So, so that is an issue. I think China, basically what happens is when the economy is not doing well, they tend to minimize or even publicly say the social welfare benefits are no longer required. And when times are good, they try to strengthen them. And I suspect, I'm pretty worried about the economy, the Chinese economy going forward. And I think we're going to see a growing trend of actually loosening those social welfare benefit requirements. We've already seen some of it actually during COVID-19. See it loosening rather than strengthening going forward.
And here's a couple questions from an anonymous participant. Can you please comment if you are aware and have read the book, The 100-Year Marathon by a U.S. General?
I have not read it. I think 100-Year Marathon, I believe, is by Michael Pillsbury, who's not a general, but he's been an advisor to U.S. governments, including Trump. And then there's another real hawkish general, Spalding, who's got, I believe, a different book. but in any case, I haven't read either of their books. So I'm afraid I can't really comment on that.
And then a second question, as a large part of the Chinese GDP is closely related to the US and other world consumption, in the event that both the supply chain issues, the increasing climate consciousness, and just much reduced consumerism may really impact the GDP. I guess there isn't a question there.
Well, I can make a comment on that.
Yeah.
I think, I think that it's a very large issue for China. I mean, one of the arguments I make, so I deal with several myths in my book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism. And the big myth I deal with is that that economic reform, capitalism being shorthand for economic reform, that was very real and drove this tremendous growth and this unleashing of productivity since reform and opening with China's entry into the World Trade Organization, that it is going to continue. And we're already seeing that over the last 5 or 6 years, particularly under the latest leadership of China, that those reforms have really stalled. And that means we will not see the sort of economic growth that we've seen and become so used to and grown to rely on in the past. Another myth I deal with is that the middle class, which is very large now, a couple or maybe a couple 100 million, depending on who you talk to, that it will keep growing in leaps and bounds. And the argument I make is that will not happen as long as China does not actually reform these legacy policies, improve education, improve healthcare, and find a way to better integrate the other half of China into its economy. So I think that we're already seeing with COVID-19 sort of we're seeing the gaps in the economy between the better off and the worse off actually grow under COVID-19. This bifurcation into a better off part of the economy that's doing well and the masses that are not doing well seems to be getting even worse. I mentioned earlier, we saw a dramatic drop in migrant worker incomes in the second quarter. And we're seeing worse and worse spending. I mean, more and more spending. I should say, I didn't mention earlier, I mean, China has one of the highest, higher and higher rates of saving. And China has one of the highest savings rates in the world. I think if you look at personal savings in China, the rate is, it's dramatically higher. It's something like 25% of income, as opposed to a global average of 8%. And that means those people are not spending. I think the trends in the economy are going to encourage them to spend even less, and therefore making that economic transition much more difficult.
Looks like we have one final question here. Comes from Colin. Was that Mo Rubo on the Businessweek cover with the Great Migration article?
Yes, that is Mo Rubo. Actually, that's not, I don't have it here. That's a different cover. Yeah, so that is Mo Rubo, and let me see. Where's, well, actually, I guess I don't need to share it right now. Yeah, so he was, I met him in 2000, first in a factory in Dongguan, then went, and he was not back in Guizhou when I went there, but I saw him on many, many visits over the years after that. And indeed, he was featured on our cover back in the year 2000. And as I said, I'm still in touch with him. He's, interestingly, there's been a large group of migrants that have actually tried to go back to their villages to sort of reinvent their lives. And in many cases, they're being encouraged to, particularly as the hukou does not welcome them to settle long-term in the cities. Mo Rubo actually is pushing back against that. And he told me in 2000, I don't want to go back. I love the city. And he's still there. And it's not easy, but he's trying to make a living, about 5 miles away from the factory that I met him in so many years ago.
Well, thank you so much, Tiff, for taking some time to speak with us tonight. And thanks to everybody for joining us tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm only, I think, just started second chapter of this book, but it's been enjoyable. I encourage you all to pick up a copy of it. So thank you, Tiff.
All right, well, thanks again, Joe. And again, thanks to John and the Northwest China Council. I hope in better days ahead, I'll be visiting you guys, and maybe we can do a speaking engagement in person. But for
Yes.
now, I much enjoyed this chance to talk virtually to all of you.
Yes. Yes. Likewise. I hope so too. I hope the world goes back to some semblance of normal at some point. But so thanks again. Thank you, everybody. That concludes the event for the evening. John, did you have anything to?
No. Thank you very much, Tiff. We enjoyed it.
Thanks,
And
John.
thank you, Joe.
Yes. Yes. Thanks a lot. All right, everyone. Have a good night. Stay safe. Thank you.